So if you're anything like me, that means that you kind of live and occupy, at least in and out sparingly, in the reptile hobby and in those spaces. And in those spaces, there's a lot of the same kind of like five or six topics that are fairly controversial or things that just pop up, like hot word button items that pop up fairly often in kind of like a circular pattern. You hear about racks a lot, you hear about laws a lot, you hear about wild caughts a lot, you hear about all these different things. And so today I want to talk about one that I've seen come up a couple different times lately, and that's reptile rescue. It's been a while since I've done a bit of a ranting video, and I'm going to do my best to not get too preachy about it, but reptile rescue, it sounds like a fairly straightforward thing, and a good thing at that. But when you actually look at what everything that kind of encompasses, it's actually much more nuanced, fairly complicated, and in some cases, pretty controversial. So I'm going to kind of break down everything that goes into it and kind of how my approach and take on reptile rescue is. So when we very first obviously look at that, we think of rescuing reptiles. A lot of the times that's usually in specific cases of, someone is moving and they're giving away the reptile, someone abandoned an animal, or, you run a reptile rescue, and we'll get to that in just a little bit, or you're purchasing an animal from like a brick and mortar big box name brand store that isn't necessarily doing their best at giving the proper needs and husbandry requirements for whatever species of reptile it is. But let's get into that a little bit. So in cases where someone is, leaving or abandoning or relinquishing, that's usually the term that I like to use, is relinquishing an animal, where a living situation happened with the reptile's owner, where something happened where they have to move, or something in their life changed, or they went through a bad life crisis like a divorce or a child or a loss of a career or something like that, that made it so they chose to hopefully give an animal a better life, and so they relinquished that. Which is, I do have several animals in my care that are technically relinquishes. For instance, Athena, the Guyana boa, who was not really feeling it, so I left her over there. That's why I'm running solo at the moment. Another one would be when people abandon reptiles. So a lot of the times I see a lot of these stories where someone who was flipping a house, or someone who was in an apartment, or someone who was renting a house or something left, and the landlords or the cleaning crew came in to clean up afterwards and get it ready for the next tenants or remodel or whatever the circumstances happen to be. And there's a red-tailed boa sitting in a 55-gallon tank in the middle of the floor without heat, or there's a box turtle just roaming around in the ducts of a house, or whatever the different little scenarios may be. That happens a lot more often than we'd really like to really talk about in the hobby. And in those cases, a lot of times what ends up is people reach out to their reptile guy, or probably most of you watching this, you're the reptile guy in a lot of people's lives, where they come to you about, hey, what type of snake is this? Or, hey, I had a question about this. Or, hey, I heard daddy longlegs are one of the most poisonous species of spider. We all get used to those questions. And in those situations, we end up either trying to help find a home for that reptile, or end up taking that reptile in. And in those cases, that's where other facilities, professional facilities like reptile rescues, do exist for a lot of the times, cases like that, or even in other cases like relinquishes or confiscations through hoarding situations or things like that. Although to hoard reptiles, you really have to not be caring or trying anymore. But when we talk about a reptile rescue, like a 501c3, reptile rescue, an actual organization, there's a lot that goes into that, and a lot of people who call themselves reptile rescues or reptile rescuers, that there's a lot that goes into it that they don't really think about or take into account. When you set one up, most of the time, and regardless of what state, city, county you live in, usually some amount of licensing or permitting and inspections have to be done. Here in Colorado, that absolutely applies, and plenty of other cities and states do the same thing. A lot of people are just working out of their basements, which there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that, but there's a lot that goes into there that someone who just works out of their basement may not be able to actually give. then we think about the condition that the animals are coming into. How many people actually get a reptile in as a rescue, snake, turtle, lizard, whatever, that's actually in a good condition? 99.9% of the time, they're emaciated, they're cold, they're stuck shed, there's health problems, there's diseases, super dehydrated. It's never a good situation. And so you have to be able to deal with sometimes an influx of a lot of those animals in very poor conditions, oftentimes that would require veterinary assistance and aid, care, medication, sometimes surgery, that even more experienced people like myself, and even more so, because I'm not going to say that I'm the biggest expert about reptile veterinary needs out there, but I'm fairly well versed in things. But there's plenty of people out there with even more experience than me that would take those animals to a vet as well, to an actual exotic specialist vet. And a lot of people working in their basements, and I know I keep going back to that, it makes it sound like I'm degrading these people, but I'm just kind of using that term as kind of a broad way of saying who aren't official, aren't licensed, just kind of working out of their house because they think they're doing their best. And that's really what I want to get to, is they think they're doing their best, but they can't really quite keep up with that. So animals in poor condition, sometimes dozens of animals in poor condition, veterinary bills, and then isolation and quarantine. You need to have the ability to physically keep separate all of these animals. A lot of us who have larger collections, and even smaller ones, do have quarantining procedures. Physical boundaries are the number one way to really aid in that quarantine, but that requires a lot of space. So if you have your own personal collection and then 2 or 3 different species of animals that need to be quarantined and separated, because there's a very good likelihood that they might have mites, they might have nidovirus. If it's a boa, they might have arenavirus. That requires testing if you're going to be very ethical about it. So that means you have to send in a saliva or a blood swab for nidovirus, for cryptovirus, if you're doing colubrids or leopard geckos, arenavirus and nidovirus for boa constrictors. All these things that a lot of people don't even take into account for their own private collections, that they also have the ability to spread to their own collections, or something that they have could spread to another animal and then redone out there. A lot of the times that these people who, and again, it sounds like I'm disparaging, I'm really trying not to, but when you see like Craigslist ads or sometimes even Facebook ads saying taking in unwanted reptiles and things like that, a lot of the times they are flippers, where they get an animal, they make sure it eats once or twice, if they're stuck shed, they make it look kind of pretty, and then they flip it for a profit. That's not always the case. There's never any true blanket statements or circumstances, but a lot of times that does happen to be the case. And so reptile breeders or people more knowledgeable about those things see those kind of keywords and usually tend to avoid posts or people like that because of those things that go in there. So an actual legitimate reptile rescue, again, often licensed, has the ability to care for them, has the money to be able to quarantine them, to give them veterinary care, to test for communicable zoonotic diseases, as well as typically they have things like a 501c3 nonprofit for their name, or they have an actual business name tied to their name, or they have like a board of trustees for certain ones where they can sit there and make with several people's input about what they should be doing as an entity. So that's kind of that little area. And then now for the last one that I really want to talk about, as far as what a lot of people consider rescuing a reptile. And that's what I mentioned at the beginning, and that is purchasing an animal, sometimes for a discounted rate from a big box store. We all know which ones I'm talking about, but many times they're usually overworked staff, underpaid staff is expected to have knowledge of over 30 different species of animals that goes from dogs, cats, birds, ferrets, hamsters, several different types of fish that include fresh and saltwater, plus the usual dozen or so species of reptiles that are commonly kept in those stores. So they usually get neglected, as well as they're not very well educated in depth about really any of those species, let alone ones they're all supposed to be experts on. So a lot of things get left the wayside. And in the case of reptiles, those are live animals, so that really sucks. It's not a great thing that happens a lot of the time. So when someone goes into a pet store, whether or not they're actually looking for an animal, maybe they're just getting supplies, maybe they're getting feeder fish, maybe they're getting dog food for their actual 4-legged furry companion. when they see a ball python that is stuck shed and is really thin, or they see an iguana that, has rub or stuff on their nose, or you see an animal that obviously has been there for a long period of time, or ones that you see there are discounted prices or the reasons why, it's hard not to get those feels, right? It's hard not to go, I'm going to give this animal a better existence. And in the immediate happenstance, you are rescuing that animal from that situation, especially if you have the ability, the experience, the knowledge how to rehabilitate that animal. You get a crested gecko that doesn't look really good. You get a kind of thin-looking leopard gecko, although a lot of times that's already a crypto-infected gecko. Or you get a ball python with a lot of stuck sheds and, has to be force-fed and all that stuff. And you bring it in and you get it healthy again. That's awesome. We love that. However, grand scheme, that's just a number for that big corporation. And so they see that continuously those numbers, that UPC code is continuously being purchased, so they'll just keep buying new animals and being put back into those bad situations. And so that's where I said this gets more nuanced and more controversial. So controversial because, well, that's the thing. Immediately, how can you not take an animal out of a bad situation, especially if you know that you can help it out of that situation? But grand scheme, you're just feeding the beast. Same with the little reptile rescues. You feel like you want to do your best by these animals. Someone can't take care of it. You have the knowledge, you have the know-how to how to keep and handle and rehabilitate those animals. But all those little factors about the situation that you weren't unaware of, that you don't have the money for, you have your own, sometimes very expensive collection that could be put at risk or could be stressed. And that isn't a very good situation either. So that's where it's controversial and every situation is very nuanced. So for me, in my case, very often I don't really do reptile rescues. I will help facilitate them. I do my best to try to line them up with people. I've been part of a situation where someone who did take in a couple very large constrictor snakes, they were lied to. It was a lot more than one or two large constrictor snakes, and I helped facilitate kind of an arranging transportation between them and another actual large facility to house these big snakes properly. Or I'll reach out to other wildlife groups and say, hey, this person could use an education animal for this. Or I know a couple people that would be interested in having a pet-only animal here and there. But in general, I really try not to take in reptile rescues as a whole because I have such a large, extensive, and expensive collection. I do have the ability to actually do a nice quarantine procedures. So in the rare cases of, for instance, relinquishments, because as I said, I do have some relinquished animals, that I can in fact put them in a really nice proper quarantine area. And that includes from private people as well as a rescuing from a big box store. I've gotten several ball pythons. Azuli, my blue iguana, was essentially given to me by one of those big pet stores after she had a fungal infection and was cut off most of her tail, and they didn't think that it would ever regrow, and she was having a really hard time for these several months she was in her store. Most of the time, they don't ever expect their animal to be in the store less than 6 months, and that's where you usually start to see those kind of discounted prices. And in some instances, I have been given or purchased, and not purchased, but purchased at a very discounted adoption fee for these animals not in great situations, where I will rehabilitate them, get them up, and then I'll usually rehome them free of charge to someone who wants a pet-only snake. Or in some of the cases, I have a piebald ball python who is, after quarantine procedures, testing, he's now part of my breeding collection. Or Azuli, who is my now pet iguana. So that's all I really wanted to say. Sorry if that wasn't too bad. I just wanted to kind of shed a little bit of light onto this kind of nuancy, kind of gray area topic that again pops up fairly often in the reptile hobby, which is reptile rescue. So when you see someone say, hey, I just rescued this animal from X, Y, and Z pet store, look at how good he's doing better, it's not really great to sit there and harp on him and say, hey, you're just feeding the beast, you're just going to make it so they can buy another animal. There's a good chance they already know that. There's a good chance they've already had that moral dilemma in the store where they sat there, but they chose to make the decision to give that particular animal, because that's what they can affect, that's what they can change, that's what they can make better. They're going to take that particular animal and save its life potentially. So maybe try not to be super harpy about things. And even if they didn't already know that, and I understand that this is a fairly general statement, but I do feel like sometimes it's better to think ignorance before malice. Maybe someone didn't think about it. Maybe someone didn't know versus they had ill intentions or they just didn't care. So hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video. It's a little bit ranty, but I like to think I kept it on a little bit of the shorter side and kind of my take on that, which is usually fairly middle of the road about kind of most things in general. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video. You'll go back to seeing regular reptile content. Hope you're having a great day, and we'll check you next time.